Halo 2 was truly a massive game in scale and in size. Bungie essentially wanted it to be the final Halo, but in the insane crunch to get the game to meet its 2004 release date, tons of content had to be scrapped, repurposed, or never even attempted during development. In this video, I'm basically going to cover most of the cut content of Halo 2 that I can personally dig up and find. I'm sure there'll be plenty of other things that were cut from Halo 2 that I'll miss in this video, but I still want to cover at least a lot, if not most, of the lost content that we never got to see in Halo 2 that I felt was worth mentioning. So, let's get into it. Overall, this is the exploration of the lost and cut content for Halo 2. Now for a quick disclaimer, I'm going to be covering a lot of this cut content for Halo 2 in mostly sections or parts, just because of the scale of how massive this whole thing is. So the first chunk we're going to go over is levels. The first bit of lost levels to Halo 2 are actually something called the Milestone 1 levels. Now these levels are actually very early levels and demo environments made by Bungie in the 2002 to 2003 period of development, mainly using the Halo 1.5 engine or the BLAM engine in the transition period with when the engine was being upgraded and retooled for Halo 2. The reason they are called the Milestone 1 levels are mainly because the levels represented the first milestone completion in Halo 2's development. They are basically just meant to show off many of the physics, gameplay, and how the later planned levels would need to proceed based on the feedback that was collected from these demo environments. Think of them as essentially glorified demo levels, if you will. Now, in E3 2003 and also in the period in 2002, these levels were shown to some very lucky members of the gaming press behind closed doors, but after this, we never really heard anything about these levels again, and most assumed they were just lost. Until just recently, a while back, the dig site team was able to retrieve these levels and release them to the public through the MCC Steam Workshop, which is overall just really awesome. Now, there were actually 3 Milestone 1 maps actually created. The first of these was a level called Defensive, which was basically a sprawling Halo CE style of map where basically you were on an island trying to defend an UNSC starship from Covenant forces. And overall, for my personal opinion of it, I think it's pretty cool. I like the sprawling hills and the terrain. I think some of the nice model work and the prototype models and the textures look pretty nice, but overall it obviously looks pretty unfinished and pretty bare bones. Still though, it's a pretty cool demo level. The next milestone level was actually a level called Exploration, which was basically a giant level on the moon essentially. You're basically in a zero-G environment and you can take out enemies using many of the physics across large and bumpy terrain on the moon. You would then enter a Forerunner installation and eventually go battle through corridors of Covenant forces until eventually reactivating the Forerunner installation and escaping, essentially being this cool little demo environment. Many assumed it was actually a lost campaign level, but sadly it was really not the case. It was mostly used as a sandbox demo-like level for the Cairo Station one that we got in the final game, just to test out all the physics in the zero-G environment. And during the brief development of this Milestone 1 level, it actually went through many different names, like the Final Moon, Moonbase, but obviously now the final name for it is Exploration, but many people know it by Moonbase today as well. And for my overall thoughts on this level, I think it's definitely the best of the Milestone 1 levels, and I think it has the most interesting environment, the best gameplay, the best mission, and overall feels the most completed. The third and final milestone level was a level called Assault, which was basically a giant sprawling level on the Halo ring with a massive Forerunner installation on a mountain. You can basically explore all around using the Warthog or maybe some mods or skulls. A pretty cool feature of this map was originally supposed to be the introduction of the stealth system that Bungie was intending to use in Halo 2. This map was basically going to be a staging ground for all of the mechanics that the stealth system was going to incorporate. It even featured an elaborate alert ranking system with different color alerts representing various levels of attack to the player and alertness from the enemy. It also would have made use of the elaborate stencil shadows and other lighting effects also to contribute to this lost stealth system that was cut from the Halo 2 and never made it to the final game. And overall, I think that the Milestone 1 levels are still really cool. I think they're a great artifact of Halo 2's development and really shows the scale and ambition Bungie was really going for in this original version of Halo 2. And the fact that we were able to finally play them is really cool and a nice bit of recovered lost media. Now moving on to other cut levels from Halo 2. And this time around, this includes a variety of campaign missions intended to be a part of the original game. Most of these levels were at various stages of development before being cut. I did mention a few of them in my Lost Story video, but I still want to explore them more in depth here and give more of a detailed explanation of what these original Lost campaign levels actually are. Alpha Moon was a cut campaign level in Halo 2. It was essentially an alternate version of the Oracle level from the final game, but with some major big differences. The setting of this level would have been on a moon called Basis, which would have been orbiting the gas giant Threshold, which was obviously the setting that we got for this mission in the final game. The setting of this map would have been essentially set in a heretic camp, and the story of this mission would have essentially been the same as the Oracle section in the final game of Halo 2. But I'm assuming it would have included more parts from the original story of Halo 2, like that original scene where Tartarus would have showed up and took out the heretic leader instead of the Arbiter doing so in the final game. Also, when this campaign level was in development, this was when the Arbiter was still called the Dervish, which was basically the original version of the Arbiter and the behind the scenes making of this level. Some cool aspects of this level would have included the fact that we would have been in the ruins of Alpha Halo from Halo Combat Evolved in the setting for this mission, with a pretty cool scene with a fight happening in the wrecked control room from the first game. Also, the level would have had tons of wreckage from the ring on the moon scattering the level. One of the primary objectives in this level, besides playing out similarly to the Oracle level and narrative in the final game, was actually going to take out a Zolt pattern Weevil cannon at some point in the mission. This cannon was featured pretty heavily in the E3 demo for Halo 2, and was one of those lost vehicles and platforms that we never got to see in the final game. Eventually though, this level got cut. It seemed it got cut mainly due to the massive scale and scope of this level and its original vision, and sadly in the rush to get Halo 2 out, it was cut into development. And also it seemed that the original hardware of the Xbox just could not support a scale and the scope of this original massive level. Described by engineering lead at Bungie about the level Alpha Moon after the fact, we were building stuff that just couldn't be played, in any engine we built and detailed, and we went a huge way down the path with a whole bunch of environments and levels for the game that just totally didn't make it. If you look at the level with the flood inside the quarantine area, that is the remaining 20% of the gargantuan sprawling level that was meticulously built and hand constructed, but that could never ever have shipped in any engine. Regardless though, this level has been known to be lost for a long time, before surprisingly reappearing in a live stream with Frank O'Connor where he was basically using an old Halo 2 dev kit and basically found the level and played it on stream. So it seems like some version of it is still existing in the real world. The build of the level was essentially using an old Halo CE engine. It had the old hub from the first game, but most of the enemy in the level and assets were actually from Halo 2, and it also ran at a very low frame rate as it was not optimized for the Xbox at the time. Before scrapping the level, there were actually brief considerations of making the level a demo for the game, but soon at least 20% of the geometry from the level was eventually used for Sacred Icon and the Quarantine Zone in the final game, with some of the geometry also making it into a prototype of a theater mode for Halo 2 as well, before also that mode getting cut. Overall, I think that the Alpha Moon cut level was actually really cool. I would have loved to explore the ruins of Alpha Halo and also explore a new moon in the Halo universe. It is a shame that we never got this level, but at least the mission that we got in the final game is also still pretty good. The second cut campaign level I want to discuss was under the working title of Covenant Ship. This level was one of the ones that we actually saw the introduction of at the XO2 event with that Halo 2 trailer. It showcased the early introduction of Chief jumping out the Cairo station onto a Covenant C-8S class assault carrier the day of Jubilation. This level was intended to have Chief, instead of blowing up the ship with a bomb in that kick-ass cutscene we got in the final game, but instead being an entire level inside the ship. It would have involved Chief crash landing onto the ship, getting inside, and taking out a lot of Covenant forces. I'm assuming showing more introductions to the gameplay of Halo 2. At some point in the level, Chief would have linked up with some ODSTs and Miranda keys. Well, basically you were actually supposed to play alongside in this level at some point. The level would have acted as sort of an introduction to a character. We would see in this original narrative, we would see that she would actually have a grudge towards Chief for her father's death, basically blaming him for the whole event. Continuing onto the level, we were supposed to use alternating trains to pass through the carrier with a view of the ongoing space battle happening on Earth on real time. And according to some of the whiteboards discussing this level, it was also meant to have a skybox dialogue option, which I'm assuming would have been more story about the ongoing battle and maybe about Miranda and her whole thing. The level would have then concluded with Chief using a Wraith, or some variations include a Scarab or a Banshee. Honestly, it's been kind of left open of what other vehicle he would use, and probably was open to the player, and basically destroy the core of the ship. Then like the game, Chief would then have landed in Johnson's Pelican and then head back down to Earth, with Miranda and her crew, I'm assuming apparently at some point during the mission, leaving as well. Now, as we all know, this level never made it to the final game, apparently despite the fact that Bungie already making a sort of portion of it for the XO2 trailer, but it was decided early on that this level would soon be scrapped for the final game. Some at Bungie described it as, quote, too much work, and in a discussion between Marty O'Donnell and Joe Staten on the Halo 2 commentary, they mentioned the level, and said it was basically cut to save development time, by replacing it with that kick-ass cutscene that basically does does the same work as this level would have done so. I overall think that this level would have been pretty awesome and I would have loved to seen it. I think more development with Miranda Keys would have been nice, and I think tearing the Covenant ship from the inside out would have been sick through gameplay. But this level I can definitely see why it was cut, as it does seem a bit unnecessary to the overall narrative of Halo 2, and I can totally see why it was cut to save time. And hey, I'm not really complaining. That final cutscene that we got in the game was pretty badass. I love that bomb scene. The third cut campaign level was a level called Infinite Succor. Concept artists Eddie Smith and Robert McLeese explored the idea of a flood-infested Covenant ship, and basically all the horror and elements that came with that. It would have involved a scenario where the flood would have taken over the ship, and the Gravemind have been formed basically from the livestock of flesh on board the ship itself. And, well, essentially the name of the ship would also have been the level name as well, which was called the Infinite Succor. The level was briefly planned out in concept art with various drawings and was discussed at some point early on in development, but it seemed like it was cut from the final game and narrative. Luckily though, the idea for this level was later reused in the 2006 Halo the graphic novel, where in the ship, the Infinite Succor as well, it focuses on a special operations commander, aka Rita, you know, that dude in Elite from Halo 2, and basically his attempts to save his comrades and survive the overall horror of the situation, in a story called The Last Voyage of the Infinite Succor. Overall, my quick thoughts on this level, I would have loved to seen this concept explored more in the Halo game. I'm not really sure how it would have fit in the already packed narrative of Halo 2, but I think that the concept still is super cool and has massive potential, maybe for like a game or even a DLC in the Halo universe. The fourth cut campaign level was a level called Forerunner Tank. I did briefly mention this in my Lost Story video, but I want to explore it more in depth here. This was basically going to be two massive levels that took place after Quarantine Zone. It would have featured a different series of events compared to the final game. Like mentioned before, it would have had Chief, Johnson, and Miranda stranded on the ring on run from the Arbiter while attempting to make contact with UNSC forces via radio. Shortly after, a Flood Hulk would have appeared, which basically was an earlier version of the Flood Juggernauts or an original enemy or the Dreadnought even. And it basically would have fought the group, the Arbiter, and also the arriving brutes and Covenant forces. Then Chief and Arbiter and the Hulk would have then fallen into the depths of Delta Halo, and then we would explore the Chief's journey in the bowels of Delta Halo. This journey would have consisted of a Chief attacking Flood forces, exploring the bowels of Delta Halo, also hints at the Gravemind and also some teases from him, and eventually, after fighting tons of Flood Juggernauts and Flood forces, we would then meet the Gravemind in a cutscene similar to the final game. We would have also seen smaller details like the Juggernauts giving corpses to the Gravemind for basically additional flesh material, which is just a creepy thought to be frankly honest with you. And we also seen through Arbiter's point of view his journey to basically meeting the Gravemind as well, instead of the cutscene where he basically just shows up. Now we have already talked about some of the story of this cuts mission, but what about the gameplay? Well, not much is truly known about it besides a few pieces of information we know and heard about over the years. In the level reportedly, it would have had the Gravemind's tentacles basically throughout the level trying to slam and attack the player. It also would have been moving slimly behind doors and shadows, basically the tentacles described as racing freight trains by some of the developers, basically acting as a long drawn out build up to the eventual appearance of the Gravemind that we eventually did see in the final game. At some point in the level, like the name of the level itself, the player would have had to use a large Forerunner tank, so to speak, as described by Jason Jones. Awesome, that blows things up, glows a lot from little windows, and moves really fast. For more gameplay aspects of this level, at some point you could have possibly had a boss battle with the Gravemind itself, but like I said, it's a bit unclear whether this was actually supposed to be in the original level. Still wanted to mention it though. Sadly though, as we all know, this level got cut, and the impact that this level left behind was actually really felt by the team at Bungie who was making the game. It sadly was just one of those brutal cuts made in the hectic development for Halo 2 in order to get the game out to its release date. Jason Jones and Joe Staten on the commentary for Halo 2 did mention the level and expressed many sorrow and sympathies at the decision to cut it. Even one of the developers for the level put in a poem expressing the pain it was to basically to cut it. Hidden in the cinematic scripts for the Gravemind and found on the Halo 2 editing kit, the poem was this: "Oh tank, ill-defined, silent monkey on our backs, no whiteboard will ever display your design. Were you raft, or Forerunner submarine, or monument to our sins?" Just a truly sad situation overall. Now, some remnants of this level, like a lot of the Halo 2 cut content, still made it to the game in some form. Geometry from the Forerunner tank level was actually later used in the gondola we see in the level Quarantine Zone in the final game. Also, some of the tech that was used for the Gravemind's tentacles in this Lost level were later used and repurposed into the mission High Charity, where we would have seen some of the Flood tentacles smash through windows and appearing in various places, so that's a kind of cool remnant of this level. Overall, I would have absolutely loved to see this level. I would have loved exploring more of Delta Halo, having a more elaborate build-up and introduction to the Grave Mine. I think it would have overall made his appearance a bit better than in the final game. And obviously that Forerunner tank we never got to see would have been awesome to play. It is a true shame that we never got to see this level, but it is still once again a really cool thing to know about in Halo 2's history. The 5th cut campaign level was actually a planned Warthog run leading up to the moment that Chief gets on the Forerunner Dreadnought in the ending of Halo 2. The level was called Forerunner's Ship, and I always found it was interesting because in most of the Halo games there's always usually a Warthog run at the end of the game, but Halo 2 always stood out because, well, there was never actually a Warthog run. But turns out to my surprise, Halo 2 originally was supposed to have one, but sadly got cut, mainly probably due to the hectic development the game endured. Luckily though, we actually get to see this level in real life in a restored mod thanks to the YouTuber Vengeful Vadam. The basic gist of this level would have been you would have basically traveled in a Warthog alongside the tracing beam to the Forerunner Dreadnought that we saw in the final game. In the meantime, you would have avoided obstacles and eventually also avoided enemies as well. This included Flood Juggernauts as well, which were also cut from Halo 2. Eventually at the end of this section, Chief would have jumped out and like the final game would have entered the Dreadnought and said those iconic lines that we know at the end of Halo 2. There were also some storyboards showcasing this ending and parts of this level as well, shown in the early development of Halo 2. Now, why did this level ultimately never made it to the final game? Especially since most of the work on this level have already been done already. The main culprit and reason behind this was probably once again they just didn't have a time to fully polish and finish it in the final game. This is especially more of the case as modders would eventually find this section in a level in the files of Halo 2, but it would see it pretty bare bones and incomplete. They would basically have to add enemies themselves, and none of the obstacles in the game are actually solid and you can drive through them themselves. So work on this level obviously wasn't complete, mainly due to the fact that the developers didn't have enough time to finish it in the hectic development of Halo 2. And honestly it was a true shame that we never got this, as once again the Warthog run has been a staple of many Halo games before and after the fact, and I think Halo 2 needed one as well. I also wanted to briefly mention as well in this lost level is that there was also a section of the original ending of Halo 2. Well, basically in the Banshee run with the Arbiter to Delta Halo's control room, there was actually supposed to be 2 scarabs that you would have fought, but this was cut in development, mainly because they didn't have enough time to make it fully fleshed out in the game. Luckily though, modders like Vengeful Vadam were able to add it back into the final game in the Halo 2 Uncut mod, which I highly recommend. And overall, I think that the level Forerunner ship would have been awesome and an essential add for Halo 2. I think it was always odd that Halo 2 never had a Warthog run, and to my surprise, it was cut from the final game. So it was a true shame we never got this, but hey, at least it was somewhat restored thanks to modders. Now for the final level that we know about that was cut from the original game of Halo 2, and that was essentially the entire third act of the original Halo 2 story, the Earth Arc levels. It was basically a series of 3 campaign levels that was basically supposed to be the ending and the finale to the Halo franchise. The story for this proposed finale starts out with Chief on the Forerunner Dreadnought, eventually jumping out and landing near the Ark, which is actually on Earth this time around. The Ark would have essentially had a design that would be later reused in the portal at Voy in Halo 3, but basically it just would have been the Ark in Halo 2. Chief would have encountered some Marines, basically giving them some much needed morale as they're trying to fight Covenant forces near the Ark. Soon they would charge the forces, and then gameplay would have then start. It's kind of unclear how this was supposed to act in the final game, but according to Joe Staten, apparently it would have been very similar to the finale of Halo 3 in spirit. It would have involved 2 scarabs, and we would have to fight them at some point. Next in the story, Chief and the Marines would then have to face an army of brutes, basically blocking the entrance to the Ark. And when hope seemed lost, out of nowhere, Covenant ships would have then glassed the army, as the Great Schism would have already taken place at this point, with the elites glassing the brutes, in a truly epic and amazing scene that we could have had. After this, in response, 7 pillars then would have came out and formed a protective shield to protect the Ark from all the glassing and fighting going around it. After this then, Chief, Miranda, and Johnson then would have headed down to a section with the Phantom, and Arbiter and 343 then would have made their way into the Ark as well. The next part of the level, according to Joe Staten, would have involved a trench run, with the Phantom and the Arbiter and 343 inside, basically descending into the Ark in gameplay, dodging obstacles, and eventually landing and fighting Covenant forces inside the Ark, and eventually reaching the Prophet Truth basically to stop the firing of the Halo rings. This section kind of reminds me of Halo 4's run into the Composer, and I would have honestly loved to see this aerial gameplay in Halo 2. The gameplay for this lost level would have involved switching between the Arbiter, or I guess the Dervish in the storyboards, and Chief, as basically they would fight with forces basically to reach truth inside the Ark, and separate little mini campaigns in the gameplay. Arbiter then would finally reach Prophet of Truth, and eventually after a brief dialogue, the gameplay would begin and a final fight with the Prophet would soon start. After this, more brief dialogue continues between Arbiter and Truth, and Chief then eventually would meet up with 343 Guilty Spark and arrive in the control room, eventually maybe indicating the fact that 343 would have been some kind of NPC ally along the way. The Arbiter then would snap Truth's neck as Chief walks up to the console. Chief then would press some buttons and eventually deactivate the Ark. The Ark then sends out blasts to deactivate the rings in the universe. Really just a cool display of the artwork here. The sudden cancellation of this would eventually cause the Ark to collapse. The Chief and the Arbiter would attempt to escape with some gameplay, I'm sure, showing the collapse of the Ark happening in real time, similar to the finale of Halo 3. Chief then would hold up some brute honor guards to allow Arbiter and 343 to escape before him. After this, in a separate journey, we would follow Chief as he runs and escapes and basically cuts to basically almost getting crushed, but eventually escaping the Ark. And then in a flash transition, we will eventually see Chief without his armor, yes, without his armor, getting awarded by Admiral Hood. We will then see Zero-G fireworks involved and basically wrapping up the human side of Halo 2's story. Moving to the Covenant side of things, Arbiter and 343 would eventually head to the Data Vault and the Ark, ultimately revealing the big twist of the game that was originally planned. Humans are Forerunner. And then after this, the finale basically ends pretty similarly to the Covenant part in Halo 3, with the elites basically going back to their homeworld and rebuilding. And funny enough, actually the original post-credits scene for this section of the game would also still have Cortana being trapped in High Charity, which is always a pretty interesting variation and hints that they were still maybe interested in making a Halo 3 in this original version of Halo 2. The legacy of this finale is still being felt in Halo and today. The early development and gameplay for this mission did actually have some decent progress, with the whole map and the Ark itself being prototyped, with even the test map recently being released by the dig site crew basically showcasing the test map that they were going to use for the Earth Ark level. And even with this test map, the sheer scale and massive size of this thing just really shows how big they wanted to make this finale to Halo 2. But sadly, the decision was made to basically cut the whole ending of Halo 2, simply because the development was so rushed and there was just never enough time to fully develop it for the late 2004 release date of the game. So Bungie basically had to make the painful decision that they felt ashamed of to basically cut it, and basically save it for a future Halo game, which they obviously would do so in the future. Now for all the progress that we know about in this mission, and like I said before, there were some progress made into this lost ending of Halo 2. Like I said before, the Ark was fully prototyped in the game already, and there was a test map developed and now released by the dig site crew. There was also early builds of the level as well coming together, as some pieces of it were shown, like in this screenshot of this jackal on Earth in the Art of Halo book. Also tons of concept art and designs were also done for this finale. We can see that artwork of the Ark here with the pillars up, which is also pretty interesting. Also in this art and even on the whiteboard here, Bungie was also used when developing the game and making the deadlines. The Ark was shown here, showcasing that they were at some point initially trying to get this thing into the final game. And another cut and lost element to this level was actually that music for this level was already scored, and dialogue from voice actors was already done for this level, just showcasing how much progress and development was already done for this level. It is super cool to hear this lost dialogue to this lost ending, like here.
This is a Forerunner? Oh. That is impossible. It cannot be.
And overall, I think it's just interesting and really cool stuff. We also have some more artwork of the scarab part of this level, which looks amazing. We also have some of Arbiter and Chief basically making their way inside the Ark, showcasing some of the designs for it, which honestly looks amazing as well. To be frankly honest, I think that this level and this original ending of Halo 2 would have been truly amazing, and it is a shame that it did cut mainly due to pure time constraints of development. But overall, I think that it would have been a great ending and a great what if for the Halo franchise. So that was the cut Earth Ark levels in the original ending of Halo 2. Now we're on to the more interesting part of cut content from Halo 2, and that is the early builds of certain levels from the final game. Halo 2's development was always in a flux, with the famous whiteboard we see in the behind the scenes for the game, just to show how fast concepts and ideas were basically cut or exchanged or repurposed. Regardless though, let's get into these lost early builds of levels. The first early build of levels I want to mention is actually the Delta Temple, which was basically an early version of the levels Delta and Regret in the final game. This early level came from the September 2003 build of the game and actually features some radically different things that we never got to see in the final game. It was actually shown off in a stream by 343, showcasing this lost and early build of the level. One major difference to this level compared to the final game is the fact that the temple was actually set in at night, and basically would have showcased a whole stealth mechanic that was supposed to be in Halo 2, but basically was cut maybe due to resources. We even have cut scripts and recorded dialogue basically showing this early stealth system in action, and overall it's pretty cool. The level would have involved lighting and also dynamic shadows, and basically you would have taken out enemies more quietly and with stealth. Covenant forces would have been on shift patrols, and depending on how the player wanted to interact with the enemies, it also would have depended on how successful he was in the level. Even calm grunts and other enemies would have been alerted if a dead body was found, and basically would sound the alarm and eventually cause all the enemies to attack the player. So it was super crucial that the player would have to use stealth basically to proceed in this section. We even have some scripts and cut dialogue for this mechanic as well in full action, which is also pretty cool. Now, why did this early version of the level never make it to the final release? Well, for starters, the stealth mechanic was hastily cut out of Halo 2 during the rush development, which basically just did not have the time to implement it properly in the final game. Another factor in why this early build of the level was cut from the final game was the fact that the intensive lighting and shadows that were required for a level like this were simply impossible on the hardware for the Xbox at the time, so that was one of the reasons why it was cut as well. And in the result, Bungie most likely reworked the level into the level we got now, which is basically more of a charge through and kill the prophet style of level that we got in the final game. Overall, I would have loved to seen how this level would have came with all the stealth and interesting game mechanics that would have been introduced in this level. I think it would have added a lot of much needed variety to Halo 2 and probably would have been a very memorable part of the campaign. Now, since this was an early level from the Halo 2 dev kit and it was actually showcased on a stream with 343, there is a copy of it somewhere, but most likely we'll never see the light of day, at least at the time of recording, but hopefully one day we'll get our hands on it and see what this early version of Delta Temple was. The second early build of a level that we got in the final game that I wanted to mention is Earth City, which is basically a combination of the level's outskirts and Metropolis from the final game. The early builds of this level that we would eventually get actually strike a huge resemblance to the E3 2003 Halo 2 demo in scope and scale. A large chunk of New Mombasa was sculpted in the map, and even Wraith and Covenant forces would have attacked you as well in a recently released map by the Dig Site crew. It was released as a map called Archaeology, and it has actually been getting fully playable, and you can actually download it on the Steam Workshop. Honestly, my real thoughts on this level is it's overall pretty cool. I kind of like seeing the bigger version of Metropolis and also the scale of New Mombasa as well, making it kind of similar in size to the E3 demo. There's also some cool features on this map like a weird Matrix style signs and also drivable civilian vehicles. I kind of wish these elements were in the final game and they all look pretty cool. And overall, a pretty cool map and honestly a really interesting early build of the level that we could have gotten in the original version of Halo 2. Also, some brief early builds of levels I want to mention but just don't really have a lot of information on include Delta Control Room, which is basically an early version of the Great Journey in the September 2003 build of the game. You would basically spawn on a Scarab docking structure before being attacked by enemies, but other than that, there's not really any other things about this early version of the level. Also, other early builds included a level called Sentinel HQ, which we've actually never seen the build of, but most likely was an early version of the Oracle level. Still though, that was overall some of the early builds of Halo 2 that I wanted to cover. Now for the multiplayer side of things. The multiplayer for Halo 2 in terms of development went along mostly smoothly compared to the campaign's development, but like everything with Halo 2's development, plenty of content was still left out of the final game. And this also goes the same for maps, as there was a lot of maps that were cut from the final game's multiplayer. Luckily though, over the years, the Dig Site team and other modders have been able to restore most of them. So regardless, let's get into these lost maps that never made it to the final game of Halo 2. Anchor Point was a cut multiplayer map for Halo 2 that was actually mostly complete but was cut during the development of Halo 2. The map is actually set on the gas giant of Threshold, the same planet that we actually play as the Arbiter for the first time in the campaign. And overall, I gotta say it's pretty neat in design, and it actually has some cool story lore as well. Essentially, after the mission on Threshold in Halo 2 when the station was collapsing, this map was basically the salvage of the heretic soldiers, and the survivors were able to build from the scraps that were left behind from that collapsing station. And overall, the design really shows it. I think it's all pretty cool with these bridges connecting separate islands on the map of scraps and also leftover debris, with teleporters throughout the map for easy access all throughout the map. And in terms of size, it's also pretty huge, and it also can support a lot of big game modes. I personally think that Assault or Capture the Flag would actually work best for it. In terms of how complete the map was, it was actually mostly complete with graphics and textures and physics all looking pretty finished. The map was reportedly cobbled together in like a week by the developers at Bungie, and basically even though it was unfinished as it did not have all the features implemented, like it had some UV issues and also some temporary texture issues throughout, still though in the final product it shows a mostly completed map. The map's original purpose was actually intended for 2v2 aerial combat with Banshees and also a small amount of players that could support the map. Now this really begs the question though, why was this mostly complete map cut? Well, the developers of Bungie felt that it really just played like crap and it was not really fun enough, so they decided to cut the map from the Halo 2 multiplayer. Now for my personal opinion on Anchor Point, I think it's overall a pretty good map, but definitely needs some reworks for sure. Like overall maybe a better cover, maybe a toned down size, and maybe better maneuverability in the map, though overall I think it's pretty good. And luckily thanks to the whole update that the Dig Site team released, everyone can actually play it using MCC on Steam and some mods. mods, which is honestly pretty cool, and overall that's one of the lost maps from Halo 2. The next map we have that was cut from the multiplayer was a map called Artery. This was basically a small Forerunner style map with basically it all taking place inside of a giant cave with basically a huge underground Forerunner structure as the general focus of the map. My theory is that even though it's mostly complete and with a lot of solid textures and it's not as horribly incomplete as some other maps that we'll cover, it's still a pretty huge prototype with tons of surfaces not finished. Overall though, I think that the concept is pretty cool and I think there's a lot of huge potential, but it seems like this was cut early on in development. And in my personal opinion of the map, I think that there's a lot of really good ideas and elements here, but overall there's not really a huge selling point as it just feels kind of like a generic map. Still though, it's an interesting case of a map that was cut from Halo 2. The next map we have is Backwoods.
I really love the library.
And unlike the name suggests, yes, this map is not about weed. Overall, it's a pretty interesting map with a lot of really interesting forest vegetation, but it's clearly shown as a very early map, very much in the works here. The map has a lot of very interesting terrain, vegetation like trees and such, and in the center, very much in a progress build, a bridge, which looked like it was the center and the focal point of this map. And also a reused skybox from other maps also attached to this one as well. This map was like the last one, probably really early in development, and it also has a lot of potential and some potentially good ideas, but once again, it just seemed like it was too early on to really tell anything from this lost prototype, and it seemed like it was just cut early on in Halo 2's development. Still though, overall, it's a pretty cool map. Now we have Soccer, and this is actually a pretty funny cut map from Halo 2, or actually Halo 2 Vista. Soccer, which is the name of the map, which according to that is in the files, not the more accurate name for the sport, football. Well, this map was actually cut later in the development of Halo 2 Vista, but it was eventually found by modders, and basically used for griffball mainly. And in general, it's not really much to go right home about. In general, it's just simply a soccer field and a stadium with some interesting Halo textures in there. Even has little goalposts on each side of the soccer field as well, just to add to the effect overall. And I think it's a pretty funny map. I mean, the fact that you're just seeing a giant Spartan just playing soccer normally in a normal soccer field is honestly just the concept alone is hilarious. I would highly recommend checking out this map, and it's luckily been released by the Dig team as well. Overall, it's a pretty funny and cool map. Now we have the map Blood Gulch _ Test, and well, like the name suggests, it was a cut early version of the map Blood Gulch that we all know made it to the final game. It seemed that this test map actually came from that early 2003 period of development for Halo 2 most likely, and is a very much just proof of concept and mostly just a prototype. Still though, overall, it's a pretty interesting early version of a map that we all know and love. I also want to mention as well, in that 2003 period of time, maps like Waterworks, Headlong, Ascension, Colossus, Lockout, and Midship, which all eventually made to the final game, also all had 2003 prototype versions of the map released by the Dig crew as well. Just kind of want to cover them because, well, these maps weren't actually released in the final game, so there's not really too much point in covering them, but just want to mention that these lost prototype versions were released by the Dig crew as well, and they're all pretty interesting to check out. Cloud City was a map cut from Halo 2, and it is actually oddly very familiar to the beginning of the mission's sacred icon in the final game, with it even reusing geometry and many assets from that level for this map. And overall, my quick opinion on it is that overall it's pretty decent. It has a lot of good spaces for fighting, but it obviously feels a pretty bit underdeveloped, obviously. Well, because it never got released. But in general, I think the layout is pretty generic and not much to it. I do like some of the weapon placements, and I do like the fact too you can actually exit the map and have a little space you can see some of the reused skybox, and overall it does feel a bit more finished compared to other maps we'll cover. But honestly though, it feels pretty generic, and I'm kinda glad it got cut, to be honest. Still though, an interesting lost artifact, and it did get released by the Dig team as well. The next map we have is Cyclone, which was a very early cut multiplayer map from Halo 2 that was only intended to be simply a giant design exercise. Max Hoberman, the multiplayer lead for Halo 2, wanted to create the smallest map possible, and basically create some design docs for the layout of this possible map. And indeed, this map was very small, only intending to actually have 2 to 4 players use it at a time, with the map even apparently having adrenaline power-ups throughout as well before that whole system got cut as well. Eventually though, the map got cut early on in development, and it seemed like it never made it past that initial stage, only appearing in design documents. Overall though, I would assume that this map would have been interesting to at least try out, but obviously it would serve as an inspiration and a basis for the future map in the final game, Midship. Still though, this lost Cyclone map is pretty interesting to know about. Now we have a map called Evergreen, and this map is pretty interesting. As the name might suggest, you might think this was actually some kind of forest map, full of forest vegetation and trees. Well, sorry to disappoint you, that's just not the case. It actually is just a desolate, rocky old map with Forerunner buildings everywhere and kind of a snowy environment. It seemed to reuse geometry from Forerunner architecture from Halo Combat Evolved, but adding more of rusted textures to it. It is overall a pretty decent sized map with both areas having spawn points for players with Forerunner buildings facing each other, and I think overall this would have been a pretty cool map if it ever got finished, and obviously some polish should have been added to it. And overall it's a pretty cool concept and kind of a shame we never got to see it. Once again though, like a lot of these other maps, it was released by the Dig Site team. The next map we have is 4th Station, which was also a cut map from Halo 2, and this one is pretty interesting and has a lot of very nostalgic vibes, and that's really one of the best ways I could describe it overall. It is an indoor map with a decent amount of players possible in it. The setting of it is some kind of UNSC station with tons of corridors and also a central hub area as well, with some power-ups and also some power weapons being placed throughout. Also some pretty cool physics, like you can actually destroy these lamps as well. And overall, it really feels like a homage to nostalgic classic maps that you would see in games like Doom or even GoldenEye, to be frankly honest with you, especially with those tons of corridors and narrow passageways as well, reminding me of those older games. The map also has the feature of teleporters, making it a bit easier to travel, and overall, I do really like this map. Its old feeling to it and nostalgic homage to games like GoldenEye honestly are really cool. And just with some polish and maybe a little bit more work put into it and maybe a redo of the layout, I think it honestly would be a top 10 Halo 2 map. It is a shame that we never got to see this, as it seemed like it made it pretty far in development, but for whatever reason Bungie cut it in the race to save Halo 2. Regardless though, at least it was released by the Dig Site team like most of these maps I'm covering in this video. The next map that we got was cut from Halo 2 was actually a map called Gauntlet, and this map is pretty interesting. It's a section out of a canyon cut out with a lot of Forerunner stuff in the middle. It is a pretty decent size overall in terms of map size, and it's also more complete than some of the other maps that got cut from Halo 2. It looks like it can support definitely 4v4s or 5v5s in terms of multiplayer or other game modes as well. There's also some really cool features on the map as well. Like, I do like some of these interesting pillars, and also some of the art design of the map looks pretty cool. But I do think that some of the spawn placements would definitely have to be fixed, because definitely some of these would have been kill zone if these ever made it to the final release. Overall though, I do think that Gauntlet looks pretty cool, and once again, like a lot of these maps was released by the Dig Site team. It looks pretty interesting though, like I said. The next map we got here is actually a really cool map that was cut from Halo 2, and that is Mission Beach. This map is similar in spirit to a map like Valhalla from Halo 3, with it being a giant big Forerunner map. But instead of Forerunner pillars and structures on each side that the player would actually spawn at, this time around the player would spawn on each side of the map in certain areas and rush to a center of an exploded bridge area with some Forerunner rooms and structures surrounding it in the canyon itself. The map was also surrounded by tons of cliffs and mountain signs, and also tons of other vehicle placements and also interesting weapon placements throughout, with also other passageways across the giant canyon in the center of the map, that which I'm sure would have been a focal point if the map ever made it to multiplayer. We also have this weird cube near one of the spawn points on the map. It looks like it was intended to be some kind of Easter egg or maybe some kind of secret extension to the map, but once again looks completely unfinished. And overall, I think this map is honestly pretty awesome. It has nice space, cool terrain, and the general design and concept is honestly pretty fantastic. It could have easily supported big game modes like BTB or 4v4, and honestly, I really like the concept of this map, and I wish it was actually finished and developed more and made to the final game. Still though, once again, at least it was released by the Dig Site team, and it's once again playable for anyone who wants to take a look at it. This map was conceived by multiplayer lead and Chris Carney, who basically concepted this map, Overboard, and a few early concept and design docs for this map. The general idea for this map is to actually focus on a structure that's sitting above a pool of water, with a skybox actually never created for this map, meaning that it was cut pretty early on in development. It's a mostly vertical map with lots of ladders for the players to use against each other, and also tons of pillars for cover as well. Even some early Halo CE teleporters were also put in as well, hinting at the possible development time frame it was actually made in. And it seems pretty obvious that this was actually an early prototype that didn't really make it that far into development. Now, why was this map actually cut? Well, the reason for its cutting was actually because the multiplayer lead for Halo 2, Max, basically disliked the map. He basically had a general philosophy that he disliked maps with vertical or rotational elements, and basically wanted maps with more horizontal mirror layouts involved, which is maybe one of the reasons why the Overboard was cut. As you can see, it's a pretty vertical map in its design overall. And overall, I think that the map is definitely unique and has a lot of really cool elements, and definitely could have been something interesting, but I do think that the vertical nature of it kind of makes it a bit confusing for players, and I think think it would just be kind of a challenge in multiplayer, so it's probably glad that this thing didn't maybe make it that far into Halo 2's development. Now for access to this map, it's kind of unclear. I believe it's some kind of files by modders that they were able to discover it, but as far as I know, it looks like it's unplayable and it's not been released formally by the dig site team. Now we have a pretty unique and interesting map that actually made it pretty far in development, and that of course was the map Permafrost, which was cut after Halo 2's release in 2004, believe it or not. Now you may be asking, how can this map even be cut after the release of the initial game? Well, in 2007, near the release of Halo 3, Bungie actually released the Blastacular Pack, which was actually released on Xbox Live for about $4 at the time. It was not really included in the 2005 release of the multiplayer pack or the 2007 Vista port of Halo 2, making it quite a unique release. Bungie actually originally intended for it to have 2 remakes of older maps, and also 1 original map. The 2 remakes were actually Desolation and Tombstone, which actually did get released in the map, but that 1 original map that I mentioned got scrapped and never made it to the cut. Now, what was this map actually about? Well, like the name suggests, it was actually an ice and snowy setting map. It was also a pretty good size, with a lot of players being able to be fit in, like a lot of big game modes like BTB or 4v4 easily, and honestly was mostly complete in prototyping and in geometry. There's actually a really cool section of the map that actually has a lot of UNSC tents, and it seemed like it was some kind of UNSC research outpost trying to research some kind of Forerunner object. There was also another section of the map that actually had an ice cave, which is honestly pretty cool and also has some pretty interesting power weapons as well, with also these really cool UNSC lights surrounding the map with some really excellent lighting. There are also some nice snowy vegetation, and there's also this big focal point of the map, which was this big Forerunner structure in the center with a light bridge in the center as well. I'm sure being a focal point that the players would have fought over if this map ever made it to release. According to the multiplayer lead of Halo 2, the light bridge could have been turned off and on by players to help swing tides of battle. And overall, I think that this map is honestly really cool with a lot of really interesting ideas. Now, why was it cut? Well, despite the fact that the map actually moved pretty far into development with the event and basically the multiplayer lead Max basically seeing a lot of potential in the idea and the map in general, the map was cut suddenly in development as the map pack's original release date collided with the release of the Halo 3 beta in 2007. So essentially Bungie had to divert resources away from this map so basically they can actually focus and finish Halo 3's beta, which is honestly a true shame as I overall think that this map is really cool. Luckily though, it has been released in its incomplete state by the dig site team. Still though, it was a shame that it never got completed. The next cut map we have was a very early concept map from Halo 2 known as Race Day. Not much is really known about this map as no known docs or images of it have surfaced online. The general idea of this map was essentially it was used for experimenting with a possible Car Wars style of a game mode involving tons of vehicles and players that would have assumed attacked each other in a lot of really cool collisions and attacks, but ultimately was cut. It seemed like alongside this initial game mode and also this initial map, it was really just nothing more than that, and the potential for there is obviously huge, but obviously it never really made it that far into development, so I really can't properly judge it. Still though, it's an interesting idea. Now we have a map called Rodentia. This map was cut from Halo 2 Vista, and it was basically a remake of that classic map from Halo Combat Evolved, Rat Race, which is honestly one of my personal favorites from that game. And as a true fan of that original map, I gotta say that this map is pretty faithful to it, with obviously having the same layout but with a lot of updated and brand new graphics and textures for Halo 2 and its new engine, and even some cool new features as well, like all these sections of underneath glass and also the floor as well, with this weird spinning Forerunner drill-like things on the bottom, which honestly add a lot of character to it as well, even with the glass windows showing more of the outside, making it feel more lively in general and less closed in, which is honestly a great improvement. There's even a section of the map where in the original map you would just go into a cave and get some power weapons, but in this version you can actually go outside and see the skybox, which is honestly a really insane and cool difference. And overall, in its general nature, this map is actually pretty complete. There's not really too much incomplete elements to it and honestly looks pretty finished. It was honestly a shame it never got made to the original cut of Halo 2 Vista. Hopefully though, one day this map can be added to matchmaking, and like always it has been released by the dig site team. Overall though, it's still a really good map. The next cut map from Halo 2 is actually a map called Solitude, and in general in concept and theme, it's pretty similar to the map Ascension from the final game. My theory is that maybe this map was a proof of concept or maybe some kind of alternate version of that map. And I would say maybe halfway it was done in development with some textures, and even some general idea of this map was prototyped and laid out, but it was cut early on in development halfway through its life cycle. It features a lot of very interesting things, like a lot of Forerunner structures with the centerpiece similar to Ascension as well. It also has the skybox with the Halo ring just like Ascension as well, with two similar sides of the map featuring platforms for sniping just like that map. Once again, just features a lot of really odd similarities, and once again kind of proves my theory that this might have been some kind of proof of concept. And overall, while I think the concept is definitely cool, I definitely prefer the final map Ascension, as it feels more organized and more interesting compared to this map, as it feels like the layout's a bit cluttered, unlike the one that we got in the final game. Maybe with some work this map could have been special, but overall I'm glad that we got the map we got in the final game. Like all these maps though, it was once again released by the Dig team, so it's playable. It's an interesting little side note overall. Sunken Temple or Sunken Chamber was a very early cut map from Halo 2 that would be very familiar to people who have played Halo 2's campaign, as this map was basically ripped straight out that one section in Mission Delta and Regret in the final game. Basically takes a part of that Forerunner structure that we fought those hunters, closed them off, and also changed a few things as well, and basically just at the last minute decided to turn that section of the campaign into a multiplayer map initially. Now, I honestly have never really hated the idea of turning some campaign maps into multiplayer maps. It's honestly a pretty interesting idea if it's, well, done well. And well, how did this map honestly do with that idea? I can definitely see why it was turned into a location of this map. It's pretty spacious overall, and there's a lot of potential for some interesting game modes like 4v4 or other giant big game modes as well in the multiplayer. And I do like the overall really interesting sort of night vibe to it. But I think overall it needs a lot more work and more retooling to make it potentially unique and also just make it a good multiplayer map, instead of just basically being lazy and copy pasting it from the campaign, which I'm sure Bungie realized the fault of their error and scrapped it early on in development due to the lack of resources and in general the idea just being kind of dumb. Still though, it's pretty interesting, and it was released by the Dig team. The next cut map was a map called Timberwind. This was basically a remake of the map only released on Halo Combat Evolved on the PC in that version. And I'm sure Bungie had initial plans to bring it to a bigger audience on console with Halo 2. And a lot of work was actually done into this map, with a lot of textures being mostly complete, prototype, and lots of textures also being put in on as well. And it also is pretty faithful to the original, and it seemed like it was originally supposed to come out in Halo 2 or most likely Halo 2 Vista, but sadly it got cut early on in development. Most likely the developers just didn't have enough time to finish all the kinks in the midst of the crazy development for those games. Overall though, I think this map is pretty cool, and I kind of wish even with some polish it was put in the matchmaking. Luckily though, it has been recovered and released by the Dig team. Now we have a cut multiplayer map called Shaft, which was originally cut from Halo 2. It's kind of similar to a lot of other maps with Forerunner architecture in it in general. It was basically carved into a canyon of some sorts with a lot of geometrical, interesting layout for all the Forerunner stuff. It's more complete than the other maps with a lot of movable objects and also tons of areas to explore without it really being buggy and glitchy. And even though it's a pretty interesting map, I'm assuming it got cut mainly just due to the issues of the layout, and the overall, there's just not really much of a selling point to this map to really make it stand out compared to other maps. I think in my personal opinion, it just need to be a bit more redesigned and just more interesting elements need to be put into it. Also maybe just less kill zones for some of the spawn points as well. And overall, I do think this map is pretty interesting, just needs some more work put into it. Regardless though, it was cut early on and well, let's just say it got shafted. Sorry for the bad pun, but that was overall the map Shaft. The next cut map that we have here is Convergence, and this was actually a cut map from Halo 2 Vista, with even an earlier screenshot version of this map shown off by the Dig team as well, showing a completely different layout. Just kind of some interesting food for thought there. Now we won't be able to cover that early version of Convergence, we'll just be covering the one that was released by the Dig team. And in general, this map's general idea is kind of similar to Ascension from the final game, but overall has a lot more unique elements and definitely being better to other maps that try to copy that map in general. It has two bases on each side of the map with teleporters, and also just a lot of really cool designs and interesting symmetrical design of the Forerunner architecture. It also has a pretty interesting center of the map with teleporters and also 3 floors that the players could interact with, even one that having a rocket launcher and also other power weapons as well on the map. And also other side of the maps with the base and stuff have also SMGs included, and even at one point in the map even an energy sword power weapon placement was also put in. I also think that it's really cool with a lot of really cool spaces for vehicles, and in general the skybox also has a really lot lot of cool, interesting elements happening in the background as well, which really adds character to the map. And overall, I think that Convergence is honestly one of my favorite cut maps from Halo 2. I think it has a lot of really cool and interesting ideas, and honestly, it feels like a little bit of a cousin to Ascension. It is a shame that we never got to see it, and honestly, once again, could easily go into matchmaking, but once again, we'll just never get to see it. Still though, like mentioned, it was released by the Digside team, so it's feel free to explore it yourself. Now we have another map that was basically a copy and paste map from the campaign, and that is the map Grotto, which is basically a ripped up pasted map from the Halo 2 campaign, specifically the level Delta Halo from Halo 2's story. And honestly, in terms of differences from that map to the campaign level, it honestly doesn't really have any differences, except for some flag posts, which I'm assuming it was designed to have some kind of capture the flag mode put into this map, and obviously in this map being closed off compared to the version in the campaign. In terms of game modes, it could have easily supported modes like 1v1 or 2v2 style, as basically this is a pretty small map. But honestly though, it's pretty basic and there's really nothing special to it. And overall, I'm kind of glad that Bungie really cut this map, as even though I like that section of the campaign, it just really doesn't work as a multiplayer map. Still though, like always, it was released by the Digside team if you want to explore it for yourself. The next map we have here was actually a remake of the map Prisoner from Halo Combat Evolved, but just basically renamed a Convict for Halo 2. I'm assuming that it was a cut map for Halo 2 Vista, as it seemed like a lot of Halo remake maps were intended for that game. It would have been obviously in Halo 2's multiplayer and would have given bigger exposure to the original map from that game. Now, I always liked the original map Prisoner, and honestly, it's pretty much the same map here as Convict in Halo 2, but just with a lot of updated textures and also just kind of incomplete in general. I do like some of the slightly different lighting, and also in general some of the different color placements honestly make it more stand out compared to the original version. And also there's some different weapon placements throughout the map, like for example where the human sniper was in the original map now has a beam rifle in it. Now this map obviously, as you can see in the footage, shows like it was pretty completed. It made it pretty far in development despite some points like maybe the placeholder elevators throughout the map, but it looks like it was mostly complete. But at some point during the end of its development, it got cut from Halo 2 Vista. And honestly though, I think it's a pretty decent map and a pretty faithful representation of Prisoner from Halo CE, and kind of a shame that we never got to see it, but at least it's been kind of revived by the Digside team. Now we're going into another section of cut maps from Halo 2, and that is mainly the Halo 2 Vista map editor example map. Basically, the backstory for these maps include the fact that with the release of Halo 2 Vista, it also came with the release of Halo 2 Vista's modding kit, which basically allowed modders to create their own maps for the game. This modding kit for Halo 2 Vista came in with a disc with one map already preloaded, and that was a map called Example. And well, like the name suggests, it was basically just a testing ground for players and modders basically to edit and figure out the tools of the modding kit for the game. But did you know originally there were supposed to be 3 maps also included in the original modding kit to basically help modders figure out the tools the game, but were ultimately never made it to the actual modding kit itself? Regardless though, let's get into these lost and cut maps from this modding kit and see what they were actually all about. The first map that was cut from the Halo 2 Vista modding kit was actually a map called Earth City Sample, which basically was a giant Earth-based testing map for modders and players. It was set in New Mombasa and overall has a lot of really nice detail and polish put into it. Basically, it's a pretty small map with basically a street filled with cars and other debris as well. It could have been speculated as maybe it takes place during the events of Halo 2 for a narrative and war reason for this map as well. And honestly, it's pretty much complete with a lot of assets being done, sound effects also being put in as well, and overall it's a very small map though, mainly used for 1v1 or 2v type of matches. It seemed like that this Earth style map was mainly just designed for modders basically to get the handle on a lot of Earth objects that the modders could use and design their Earth style maps for Halo 2 Vista. But like a lot of these example maps, it got cut pretty early on in Halo 2 Vista before its release. Eventually though, actually in a weird little story, later on it was actually released by one of the developers at Halo 2 Vista, Hired Gun, who basically helped port the game to Vista and basically uploaded this map to halomaps.org, and even later on it also got released by the Digside crew as well, basically for more general and easy access to it. Overall, I think this map is honestly really cool and also pretty well complete. I think that even though the small nature of it kind of puts me off, I think that there's a lot of potential and really cool matches that could have been had here if it was released, and also there's a lot of really cool botting possibilities as well. The next map that was cut from the kit was actually a map called Beach Battle, or basically Forerunner_sample. The map's general idea is that it's set on a beach with 2 bases on either side of the map, with a central Forerunner structure in the middle, with the skyblock set on a Halo ring, maybe possibly Delta Halo, I'm just speculating. You also sit right next to a beach as well, which is one of the major focal elements of this map. You actually go into the water and see all the really nice water effects as well on the edge of the map. There are also some interesting power weapons like a rocket launcher in the center of the map, and also some silent SMGs placed on each side of the map, which were actually cut weapons from Halo 2 that made made it to Halo 2 Vista. And overall, my opinion of it is I think it looks fantastic. It looks pretty complete with really nice water animations, skybox, and overall I think that the design of the map looks fantastic. It was a shame that it got cut from the modding kit, but hey, it at least eventually did get released by one of the developers, like I said, Hired Gun, and also the dig site crew as well. And honestly, it's a beautiful map, and I wish it could have made it into matchmaking. Now for the final map that was cut from the kit for Halo 2 Vista. Now, like a lot of these sample maps, this one was actually themed for another side of Halo, mainly for the Covenant, unlike the previous two maps. But unlike the two maps that actually did get an online release by one of the developers, this map actually never got an actual online release. So for a while, what this map actually was kind of a mystery. We can kind of see from some of the screenshots, it looks similar in style to like maps like Midship from Halo 2, and honestly it looked pretty interesting, just kind of a Covenant version of maps that we've seen before from the modding kit. And for many years it was kind of deemed as lost content for Halo 2 until years later it was actually released by the dig site team. From what I can see, it's definitely got a lot of similarity to like the previous mentioned Midship, but also Gemini as well. I think overall it looks pretty interesting, but there's not really much else I can say about this map. And now finally for the development test levels for Halo 2 that never made it to its final release. Obviously these are levels strictly for testing purposes and basically to further development ideas into Halo 2, and were never really meant to be shown to the public as playable levels, just mainly sandbox and testing environments. Regardless though, there's still a pretty interesting cut content for Halo 2, so let's get into these lost and obscure test levels. Now for the first cut level that we have here is actually a level called AI Test, and it actually, well, like the name suggests, it has a very file type of name. It was mainly just a testing environment from the September 2003 build of Halo 2. It had pretty much a simple corridor Forerunner design to it, with some finished textures here and there, even though in parts it also had those UV textures as well, basically just to show how early and once again how much of a test level this thing was. A build of this level was actually played on stream by Frank O'Connor in 343. The player in this level would have had to fight 2 hunters in this map. There's also supposed to be a Banshee in it, but once again it would have not even been able to fly in it since this was basically a closed indoor map. The player would have spawned into this map and had early versions of the SMG and battle rifle, and like mentioned, it looked like it was just some kind of testing environment by Bungie, maybe to test out the enemies or the weapons or other elements. And overall, it's just a very bare bones map, even more bare bones than other cut maps from Halo 2. And like mentioned, it was just a testing environment, so that kind of makes sense to its bare bones nature. Still though, overall, it's a pretty interesting and lost piece of Halo 2 cut content. Who knows, maybe we'll see it one day. The final test level that was cut from the game was a level called Audio Playground, and like the name suggested, was even more of a test level than the previous one. It was actually shown quite a few times in the behind the scenes doc for the making of Halo 2. It featured a very large terrain where the player would basically test hitting objects or gunfire on a variety of surfaces, which are labeled as dirt, solid steel, ice, water, and every surface in the final game if possible. Its general purpose was basically just to test sound, physics, and basically how everything looks in the engine. And overall, I think it's just a fun little test world. It honestly was something never made for the public and just strictly for the developers at Bungie, but I honestly think one day I wish this thing would actually be made available for everyone to play. It's such something of a little fun test ground just for everyone to try out in Halo 2. The next test level that was cut from Halo 2 is, well, technically a test level. And that is actually Halo 2's E3 demo 2003. This demo has basically gone down in history of Halo 2 as being very infamous and also being mostly smoke and mirrors, as essentially it promised a version of Halo 2 that was just impossible to play on the Xbox. And just for your clarification, I do consider it a test level even though it's also a demo, as it once again was just a test environment for what Bungie wanted to do with Halo 2, but ultimately found it impossible with the current hardware at that time. I will go into further detail about this level in a future video to basically it really just deserves its own video as the topic itself is so large and intricate, but I'll give a brief overview of what this demo was. It was a demo being developed by Bungie shown off at the E3 of 2003 with a giant theater display and also a really cool interactive display at the beginning of it with Sergeant Johnson and also some Bungie employees. And then it basically would have showcased a very early version of the Earth City level that was being developed for Halo 2's original story. The reason why it's gone down so infamous in the community is the fact that it features so many elements that just did not appear in the final game, like the crazy stencil shadows, the really dynamic lighting, and also some of the gunplay as well, and well, vehicle hijacking animations as well, just never featured in the final game. It also featured a version of New Mombasa that seemed more grand and open, and also just more dynamic sequences in the game overall. And it is really just a huge shame that we never got to see this version of Halo 2 realized. Now, you may be asking, why was this version so infamous, and why is it technically a test level and, well, never made it to the final game? Basically, after the development of this demo, which was already a struggle in itself, they realized after E3 that basically that this demo and all of its hardware was impossible for Halo 2 on the Xbox. The hardware that was used to run this demo was already struggling on Bungie's hardware alone, and it was impossible on the Xbox. So Bungie essentially had to scrap all their work and ideas that they had for the E3 demo. And well, that's mainly the reason why it's so infamous in the Halo community. Overall, I love this demo. I love the little interactive display at the beginning, and overall, even though it's fully uploaded online, I think it's honestly pretty fantastic, and I wish we got this version of Halo 2. And eventually the Diggside team eventually released the E3 demo, and honestly, like the legendary status it prevails, it honestly is fantastic. I highly recommend y'all check it out on Halo MCC Steam. Now that we have covered many of the lost levels for Halo 2, now we can finally dive into the huge amount of cut enemies, NPCs, and other characters that were cut from Halo 2. So regardless, let's get into this mess. The first enemy that was cut from Halo 2 was actually most notably the Flood Juggernaut, which was actually a massive tank flood form that was actually supposed to be in the original game. It was basically supposed to act like a mini boss battle for the player to defeat. These Flood Juggernauts would basically act as mini intelligent bosses on the battlefield and basically would help gather the flood and attack the player in routes and also decisive maneuvers. It was kind of similar in design to like the Hiragok, which was also cut from Halo CE. It featured having these massive tentacles, and even on legendary difficulty, it would kill the player in just 2 strikes, and also could knock away any cover as well that the player was hiding behind. You'll also go into this sort of berserk mode and rage against the player, basically almost killing or most likely killing the player. The Juggernaut would also go into this mode called Berserk, that basically once this thing was actually almost dead, it would basically launch against the player in a full fury of attacks. So to say this thing was actually deadly and also awesome would just be a giant understatement. The design of this enemy was actually pretty much mostly finished in Halo 2, as it actually was found in the files by modders years later and actually brought back to light with full animations and also was able to be killed. The weak point on this creature to kill it would have been its eye, and you can also of course shoot the flood and melee it as well, but if you do that it would mostly just stun the creature, so you would definitely try to kill it at its eye for the most part. Also, kind of a weird, strange element to this cut enemy was the fact that it was also found in the files by modders for Halo 2 Anniversary, but this time around without the finished textures like in the original Halo 2 model. Who knows, maybe they were intending to actually include this cut enemy in the Anniversary version of Halo 2. Now, despite the fact that the Flood Juggernaut was actually pretty much finished with full-on textures and animations, it wasn't fully finished in design though, as it actually did not have a death animation when you killed in the game. It basically would just freeze in place as Bungie never got the chance to finish this flood form. I also wanted to mention other appearances and things it could do as well. This Flood Juggernaut also appeared pretty prominently in those original storyboards for Halo 2, indicating its original idea and placement in that original narrative. It'll also do things like slam its tentacles to the ground and also taunt the player as well, which honestly just sound amazing. But sadly though, these mechanics weren't actually put into the place in the model that we have today. Apparently the Flood Juggernaut was just supposed to spawn most likely one time per level for the player. And the files of Halo 2 show that this flood was actually supposed to be in the levels the Oracle, the Sacred Icon, and Quarantine Zone in the final game before it ultimately got cut. According to Robert McLeese, who helped design the enemy, the Juggernaut was supposed to be this uber-intelligent mini-boss, but the suggested intelligence was way too high for what the design needed to use it for, which was a big tank. And overall, that was the general idea for this lost and cut flood form, but sadly as we all know, it was cut from Halo 2, most likely because Bungie just did not have enough time to implement it and get it fully finished in the game to the degree that they may have wanted it to. This was most likely just one of those last-minute cuts Bungie had to make in the brutal development of the game. This is even more supported by the fact that there was even audio recorded in relation to the enemy and its interactions.
The Eye Arbiter! Aim for its eye!
And overall, yeah, pretty cool stuff. And as you can see, there was just a lot of substantial progress, but sadly it just got cut from the final game. Luckily though, unlike a lot of cut elements from Halo 2, the Flood Juggernaut actually did make its way into Halo War, as was mentioned a few times in the Halo Wars 2 logs, before eventually making its full-on appearance in Halo Fireteam Raven, the arcade game, which is honestly just really cool, and honestly I love the fact that this lost and cut enemy finally made it into the Halo universe. And overall, I think that the Flood Juggernaut from Halo 2 was a fantastic cut enemy, and it was really just a true shame that we never got to see it in the final game, as it was just pretty much mostly complete. I love its general design, I love its really cool animations, and just some of the ideas that some of the developers were going to put into this thing just really sound amazing. It's a true shame that we never got to see this lost and cut enemy, but at least this thing actually made it to the Halo franchise one way or another. The second character that was cut from Halo 2 was actually this thing called the Space Jellyfish, which I know sounds super silly. This was supposed to be a native life form mainly to the gas giant Threshold that was was originally obviously the setting in Halo 2 for the level The Arbiter, or originally Alpha S Gas Giant, which was the original name of that level for Halo 2. This life form basically would just sort of fly around the map as the player would be doing tasks and really just wouldn't interact with the player or even harm to it. It would just basically just give some life to the gas giant and add some additional lore to the planet as well. The concept was created by Dave Dunn at Bungie, and it was based on the real-life theory of hypothetical life forms on the gas giant Jupiter, which was the origin for this idea. The sounds, according to the designers for the creature, he described them as whoop whoop, which honestly just sound hilarious. Now, a lot of substantial work had actually been done on the space jellyfish, but overall it was just not yet finished. It had a lot of textures and even a 3D model created, but it wasn't obviously fully finished, with even just in the game just appearing as sort of a gray, textureless thing flying around. It was discovered by Halo 2 modders in the game files under the name space_blimp. And luckily though, over the years since its discovery, it has made it into mods like Halo 2 Uncut, but like I said before, were mostly unfinished. Overall, I really like the idea of this NPC, and honestly it just would have given more character and lore to the gas giant more so than in the final game, which honestly is pretty cool and just kind of harmless to the overall universe. I think it's a shame that we never got to see it. The third NPCs and enemies that were cut from Halo 2 are actually included in the original version of the Delta Regret levels of Halo 2, known originally as Delta Temple in the original Halo 2 build. Now, these early versions of level were supposed to introduce the original stealth mechanic of Halo 2, complete with patrols, an escalation-like alert system, and even the idea that a dead body could sound the alarm and attack the player. Now, the reason why I mention this is that there are actually cut enemies to this system, and that is actually one of them was the Comm Grunt, which was of course a grunt but mainly with comm gear and would have contributed to the whole basically stealth system of the game. According to cut dialogue from the stealth section of the game from Cortana, basically if the Comm Grunt found anything out of the ordinary, it would have alerted the entire Covenant the Chief's presence, causing all of the enemies to know where you were and attack. Sadly though, this enemy alongside the original version of this level was cut from the final game, as basically Bungie just did not have enough time to implement the stealth mechanics, as they deemed that the engine that they was originally used to implement all this system was too complex for the original game, so ultimately this entire system, including this variation of the grunt, got cut. Overall, I think that this enemy is super cool, and in general I think this whole system would have added much more development and really just cool elements to Halo games that we've never really seen before. And I kind of wish it just made it to the final game, but once again it's a shame that we never got to see it. Still cool to know though. The fourth thing cut from Halo 2 was the concept of the alien trooper. This character was intended to be a combination of elites and other life forms from the Covenant. This character and concept was actually shown in the behind the scenes doc for Halo 2 with some concept art made and also just basically being discussed early on by Bungie, but it looks like later on in development it was cut as the team basically did not have enough time to fully implement it into the build of Halo 2. Overall, I think that the idea is a pretty loose concept in general, but I think that the initial idea sounds really good, and I would have loved to see it expand in the final game, as once again more enemies of the Covenant is not always a bad thing. The fifth thing that was cut from Halo 2 is the infamous Sharkoi, which was also the original giant enemy cut from Halo Combat Evolved, also known as the Dreadnought. Once again, like Halo Combat Evolved, this enemy was also considered for Halo 2. It actually appears in some storyboards, appearing as a mural in the Covenant while the prophets were discussing the history of the Covenant. It also appeared in using the model from Halo CE, but just with updated textures in Halo 2. But it looks like somewhere in the development of Halo 2, it was once again scrapped by Bungie, despite the fact that it had a full-on model and render created. Luckily though, despite the fact that this enemy never made it to Halo 2, later on in the Conversations from the Universe booklet that was actually included in the limited collector's edition of Halo 2, it was actually mentioned in the booklet, officially confirming the existence of the enemy in the Halo universe. Which, I mean, overall it's better than nothing, I guess. And even future books like Halo Envoy also expanding upon this cut enemy later on down the line. And even later on, the dig site team actually recovered the Dreadnought from Halo 2 and released it in some files in their recent GitHub repository update from the game for the dig site crew. And honestly, it looks fantastic. I love the animations, how it looks more updated than it did in Halo CE, and honestly I wish it made it to the final game. It always sucks, and it's honestly a truly tragic tale with the Dreadnought, as it once again, it always seems that at some point in the Halo game's development, it's always considered, even designed and created, and just randomly just gets cut for whatever reason in development for those games. Honestly, it's a true shame. I love this enemy, and I would love to actually see it finally in a Halo game. The sixth thing that was cut from Halo 2 was the Disintegrator Hunters. These seem to be variants of the Hunter, but this time around attached with a lost and cut weapon called the Disintegrator attached to them. These were basically cut cut weapons from Halo 2 that acted as sort of a Covenant flamethrower. Now, obviously, since this weapon got cut, this variant of the Hunter also got cut as well. Now, how do we actually know about this enemy's existence? Well, it was actually discovered in the Halo 2 files for Halo Vista, with some audio recovered for the enemy as well, but once again, all this enemy was cut from the final game, which is honestly a true shame that this cut weapon and this variant of the Hunter never made to the final game. I think it would have added some much needed variety to some of the enemies.